Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has died. His office says he passed away following a brief and sudden illness. In a Truth Social post, President Donald Trump called Graham one of the greatest people and senators he has ever known.
He was on the phone with the President of the United States just hours before he died, and by the time the sun came up the next morning, one of the most complicated friendships in modern American politics was over for good. Donald Trump would later say it himself, almost in disbelief, that the call might have been the last conversation he ever had with a man, and what happened in the hours after that phone hung up turned a quiet Saturday night in Washington into the kind of story the entire country woke up to. Lindsey Graham died on the night of Saturday, July 11, 2026, at his home on Capitol Hill. He was 71 years old. His office released a short statement in the early hours of Sunday morning saying only that he had passed away following a brief and sudden illness, and asking for privacy and prayers during what they called an incredibly difficult time. That was it. No further detail, no explanation, nothing else. Just a handful of careful sentences that left the entire country to fill in the blanks for themselves, and fill them in they did, almost instantly. What actually happened, according to emergency responders and later confirmed by medical examiners, was much simpler and much sadder than anything the internet dreamed up in the hours that followed. Paramedics were called to Graham's Capitol Hill home Saturday evening after he began suffering chest pain. Within a short time, that emergency had turned into a full cardiac arrest, and crews worked to save him before he was rushed to George Washington University Hospital, where he passed away. The following day, the medical examiner's office released preliminary findings. Graham had died of an aortic dissection, a tear in the body's main artery, brought on by arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. In plain language, hardened arteries that had been quietly working against him, likely for years, without any outward sign that anything was wrong. That detail matters, because barely 24 hours before he died, Lindsey Graham looked like the last man on earth you'd expect to be gone by morning. He had just returned from his 10th trip to Ukraine since the full-scale invasion began, meeting once again with President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev. He toured facilities connected to Ukraine's drone production. He spoke with the energy of a man half his age about the country's ability to innovate its way through a war of survival, and he stood in front of reporters and delivered what he clearly believed was one of the proudest announcements of his career, that he had reached an agreement with the White House to move forward on a long-delayed Russia sanctions bill, one aimed at squeezing the country still propping up Moscow's war machine. He told reporters he had never felt more optimistic that there was finally a real path to ending the war. He was, by every account from people who were with him that week, not a man winding down. He was a man mid-fight. Then he got on a plane, flew back across the Atlantic, landed in Washington, and by that evening he was gone. Trump later told NBC News that he had spoken with Graham on Saturday night, and that other than sounding tired from the long flight, the senator seemed completely fine. Trump posted a tribute on social media calling Graham one of the greatest people and senators he had ever known, describing him as a true American patriot, and he ordered flags across the country lowered to half-staff. On live television the next morning, Trump's voice carried a heaviness that was hard to miss for a man who rarely lets the cameras see him rattled. He talked about how sudden it all was, how the two of them had just spoken, how there had been absolutely no warning. That heaviness in Trump's voice wasn't performance, and it wasn't really surprising if you understood how far the relationship between these two men had traveled. It's easy to forget now, but Graham spent much of 2015 and 2016 as one of Trump's harshest critics inside the Republican Party. He called him unfit for office. He warned publicly that nominating Trump would be a disaster for the party and said, in one of the more quoted lines of that campaign, that Republicans would get destroyed and would deserve it. After the January 6th attack on the Capitol, Graham stood on the Senate floor and said he was done, that enough was enough. If you had frozen the relationship at either of those two moments, you would have assumed these were two men who would never speak again. Instead, Graham became one of Trump's closest allies in the entire Senate. He was a frequent golf partner. He became one of the president's most trusted voices on foreign policy, someone Trump leaned on for guidance on Ukraine, on Iran, on NATO. He helped guide Trump's Supreme Court nominees through brutal confirmation battles during his first term. And it wasn't only Trump who felt that loss. Democrats who had fought Graham for years on the Senate floor said they had lost not just a colleague but a genuine friend, the kind of relationship that had somehow managed to survive decades of disagreement without curdling into bitterness. That is an unusual thing to pull off in Washington, and it's part of why his death landed across party lines the way it did. Some of the loudest tributes, fittingly, came from Kiev. President Zelensky called Graham a true defender of freedom, someone he had been in constant contact with, someone who had spent his final working weeks pushing for tougher sanctions on Russia specifically because he believed it could help bring the war closer to an end. NATO Secretary-General praised him as a powerful advocate for the alliance. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said America had lost a great patriot and Israel had lost one of its most committed champions. For a single senator from South Carolina, the scale of the international response said a lot about just how far his reach had extended over more than 2 decades in Washington. Now, inevitably, because the initial statement from his office gave the public so little to go on, speculation filled the silence almost immediately. Some voices online, including the activist Laura Loomer, publicly floated the idea that Russia might have been involved in Graham's death, pointing to the timing. A man who had spent years pushing sanctions and weapons for Ukraine, dead within a day of walking out of a war zone. It's worth being straightforward about this part. Multiple law enforcement sources told reporters there was no indication whatsoever that Graham's death involved anything other than natural causes, and the medical examiner's own preliminary findings backed that up directly, pointing to a specific, well-understood cardiovascular condition rather than anything suspicious. Russian and Iranian state media did seize on his death to gloat, which is its own uncomfortable footnote, but gloating from state propaganda outlets isn't evidence of anything beyond how deeply Graham had gotten under the skin of both governments over the years. When you look at the facts as they've actually been confirmed, the far more likely explanation is also the saddest one. Graham had a documented family history of heart disease. His own father died of a heart attack in his late 60s. The man who had spent his whole career pushing himself at a breakneck pace, flying overseas constantly well into his 70s, was carrying a condition that gave almost no external warning until it was too late. If you want to understand why his death hit people as hard as it did, why a president who spent years trading insults with him could barely get through a sentence about him, why senators from the opposite party stood up to call him a true friend, you have to go back to where Lindsey Graham actually came from, because it explains almost everything about the kind of loyalty he gave people for the rest of his life. He was born in 1955 in the small town of Central, South Carolina, and grew up living with his family behind the liquor store, restaurant, and pool hall they ran to get by. It was about as far from Washington power as you could get. When Graham was in his early 20s, both of his parents died within about a year and a half of each other, his mother from cancer, his father not long after from heart trouble, the same condition that would eventually take Graham's own life decades later. That left a young man barely out of college suddenly responsible for a teenage sister and a struggling family business, with no one else to lean on. Graham didn't walk away from that. He became his sister's legal guardian, and he later formally adopted her so she could access his military benefits, all while trying to hold together what was left of the family business back home. His sister, Darlene, has described him over the years as having been a brother, a father, and a mother to her all at once. One person carrying all 3 roles because there was no one else left to do it. Graham never married and never had children of his own, and when people ask him about it over the years, he tended to brush it off with a joke, saying he never found the time to meet the right woman, or that the right woman was smart enough not to have time for him. It's the kind of line politicians use to close down a question they don't want to sit with, but underneath it was something real. A man whose capacity for family had already been spent early, poured entirely into the sister he refused to let anything happen to. That same instinct, showing up, staying loyal, refusing to abandon people even after brutal disagreements, is arguably the through line of his entire career, and it's exactly what people kept returning to in the tributes that followed his death. It's the same instinct that had him flying to Ukraine for the 10th time in a war most Americans only see through headlines, and it's the same instinct that turned a man who once called Trump a kook unfit for office into one of his most trusted allies in Washington. There is also real unfinished business sitting on Graham's desk the week he died, and it's become its own kind of tribute in the days since. For more than a year, he had been the driving force behind a sweeping Russia sanctions package, one aimed squarely at the countries still helping fund Moscow's war effort. He had just told the world in Kiev that he believed the White House was finally on board and that the bill was going to become law. Lawmakers from both parties, including Democrats who had worked alongside him on it, have since said that passing that bill is now the most fitting way to honor what he spent his final year working toward. If it does pass, it will do so with Graham's fingerprints all over it, closing out a fight he never got to see finished himself. His death also left an immediate and very real vacancy. Graham had just won his Republican primary weeks earlier and was actively campaigning for another term, having held that South Carolina Senate seat for more than 2 decades, only the 3rd person to hold it in nearly 70 years, following the legendary Strom Thurmond before him. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster appointed Graham's own sister, Darlene Graham Nordunn, to serve as interim senator, filling the seat left behind by the man who had raised her. It's the kind of detail that reads almost too neatly symmetrical to be real, except that it is. The sister he became a father to as a young man is now, in some form, carrying on where he left off. So when you strip away the noise, the online rumors, and the speculation that predictably followed a sudden death with too little public explanation, what's actually left is a far simpler and more human story. A 71-year-old man who never really slowed down, who was still flying into war zones and negotiating sanctions bills at an age when most people have long since stepped back, was carrying a heart condition that gave him almost no warning before it caught up with him on an ordinary Saturday night at home. There was no plot, no poison, no shadowy conspiracy. Just a man whose body finally gave out after a lifetime of running toward every fight he thought was worth having, right up until the very last one. What do you think made Lindsey Graham's story so unusual? The decades-long turn from Trump critic to Trump ally, or the quieter story of the family he built out of loss when he was barely in his 20s? Let us know in the comments.